The fluorescent lights above flickered, a cold, clinical hum that seemed to amplify the nervous energy vibrating within Natasha Fields. She sat hunched, her hands twisted together in her lap, thumbs rubbing over knuckles gone white, a small, desperate ritual of self-comfort. The Brooklyn family court, despite the July heat outside, felt colder than she'd expected, a chill that seeped into her bones, or perhaps, she mused, it was simply her own internal frost. Across the heavy mahogany table, Robert lounged, his posture a careless sprawl of entitlement, convinced that the world, and indeed Natasha, owed him everything. He wore his most expensive suit, sharp and navy, a deliberate statement of power and untouchable confidence. Even now, the cloying scent of his favorite cologne, the one she'd bought him last Christmas, clung to the stale air, a sickly sweet reminder of things she could never have back, of a past irrevocably poisoned. Strangers dotted the far benches, their collective quiet a heavy weight in the room, awaiting their own turns before Judge Whittaker. A tired bailiff leaned against the door, chewing the inside of his cheek, a small, nervous habit that Natasha barely registered. Her gaze, drawn by an almost magnetic pull, kept wandering back to Robert's hands, perfectly manicured, tapping a slow, steady rhythm against the table. Those same hands that once held hers through countless subway rides, through the biting cold of their first New York winters, and the oppressive heat of endless summers in their cramped Bed-Stuy apartment. Now, they were the hands of a stranger, cold and detached. The past month was a blur of ugly, visceral details. The divorce papers had arrived in a thick manila envelope, delivered by a man whose face she'd never seen, who pointedly avoided her eyes. Robert had been waiting across the street, in his polished BMW, engine purring, his gaze as cold and unforgiving as glass. No warning. No argument. Just a final, brutal dismissal. When she stepped outside, clutching the damning papers to her chest, he'd rolled down the window, his voice low, almost bored. Good luck starting over without anything. That was the last time she'd heard him speak directly to her until today, this very moment, in this suffocatingly sterile courtroom. The court clerk's voice, echoing in the near silence, called the case, docket number 2217, Fields versus Fields. Natasha flinched at the sound of her married name, a name that felt like a painful scar. Tamika Johnson, her attorney, a steady anchor in the churning sea of Natasha's anxiety, leaned in and squeezed her shoulder. "Breathe, Natasha," Tamika whispered, her voice a low, firm balm. "This isn't his victory lap. We fight today for everything." Judge Whittaker entered, his robe swishing softly as he settled behind the high desk. His face was a roadmap of lines, his eyes tired but shrewd, missing nothing. Natasha felt his gaze linger on her for a second longer, a weary but watchful appraisal that made her feel utterly exposed, as if he could see the accumulated years of sacrifice etched into her very bones. Robert's lawyer, Mr. Goodman, stood, the very definition of smug in his impeccable grey three-piece suit. "Your Honor, we're here to finalize the dissolution of marriage between my client, Robert Fields, and the respondent, Natasha Fields. The terms are clear. There's a prenuptial agreement that assigns all current and future business holdings and properties to Mr. Fields. Mrs. Fields is entitled to a modest settlement." His words were slick, practiced, dripping with a dismissive finality that made Natasha's throat tighten, a bitter taste rising in her mouth. But Tamika was already on her feet, her presence commanding in her fitted black blazer. "Your Honor, we challenge the validity and enforceability of this prenuptial agreement. We have evidence that not only did Mrs. Fields contribute significantly to the business in its formative years, but that the document in question was never properly filed with the county clerk's office. There is no witness signature, no notary stamp. We ask that the court consider the substance of the marriage, the sacrifices made, and the true origin of these assets." Robert rolled his eyes, staring straight ahead, refusing to acknowledge Natasha. The judge, with a raised hand, silenced any further argument, his gaze sharp. "Let's start with testimony," Judge Whittaker said, his voice measured. "Mrs. Fields, please stand." Natasha's legs wobbled beneath her as she rose, her heart thudding so loudly she worried the bailiff could hear its frantic beat. This was it. The fight for everything. Natasha's voice, thin at first, trembled with a vulnerability that belied the steel growing within her. When Robert started his company, we had nothing. Her words, slow and deliberate, began to fill the sterile courtroom, each one a chip against the polished facade Robert had constructed. I worked 2 jobs, sometimes 3, just to pay the rent. I built his website. I worked with his first clients. I handled the finances when he didn't know how. Her voice gained strength, fueled by a simmering resentment and the undeniable truth of her narrative. When the business finally got its first investor, I was the one who convinced them to take a chance on us. She looked at Robert, whose face remained a stone mask, impenetrable. Everything we have, we built together. The life we had. I was the foundation. I gave up my own career to support his. Mr. Goodman, Robert's lawyer, crossed his arms, his mouth twisting into a condescending smirk. But your name is not on the LLC. You were never an official partner. Correct? Natasha didn't flinch. The question, intended to diminish her, only highlighted Robert's betrayal. That was Robert's decision, she stated, her voice steady. He said it would protect us from risk. I trusted him. The judge, his face inscrutable, scribbled notes, his gaze unwavering as he absorbed the weight of her words. Mr. Fields, would you like to respond? Robert rose slowly, drawing every eye in the courtroom, basking in the spotlight. He spoke with the easy confidence of a man who truly believed himself untouchable. Your Honor, Natasha helped at the beginning, sure. But this company, my late nights, my risks, my vision, she handled emails. She kept the house running, but the business was always mine. He slid a folder across the table, a theatrical flourish intended to underscore his point. The prenup is crystal clear. Respectfully, Your Honor, Tamika interjected, cutting him off, her voice a sharp counterpoint to Robert's bluster. This so-called prenup is missing both a witness signature and notarization. We have documentation from the county showing it was never legally filed. Judge Whitaker took the document, holding it up to the light, his expression unchanged, yet Natasha felt a ripple of tension spread through the room. Robert, for all his outward confidence, now had a subtle, nervous rhythm to his knee bouncing under the table, a tell that Natasha recognized intimately. I'll be the judge of its validity, the judge stated, his voice even, before Robert sat down with a victorious smirk aimed directly at Natasha. Witnesses were called. Robert's current CFO testified, his answers clipped and evasive. Yes, Mrs. Fields was around in the early days, but she never attended board meetings. All legal and financial decisions were made by Mr. Fields. Tamika countered with a deluge of evidence, old emails, social media posts, texts, a digital breadcrumb trail of Natasha negotiating contracts, attending crucial strategy meetings in the business's infancy. The next witness was Natasha's sister, Yvette, whose voice trembled with raw emotion as she spoke. I watched my sister lose herself for this marriage. She gave everything to Robert, and he took it all for granted. She was there when the company was nothing but a dream and a laptop on our kitchen table. Natasha's eyes blurred, but she held back the tears, refusing to grant Robert the satisfaction of seeing her break. More evidence followed, relentlessly. Tamika produced bank records showing joint accounts used for significant business expenses. Pictures of Natasha at launch events, beaming, holding business cards with both their names. Every new detail, every documented interaction, chipped away at Robert's carefully constructed narrative, revealing the truth beneath. His jaw tightened, his lips pressed into a thin, white line. The day wore on, outside the sun began to fade, casting long, blue shadows across the courtroom floor. Natasha's muscles ached, every fiber screaming with exhaustion, yet she forced herself to stay upright, feeling the eyes of everyone in the room, waiting, watching, to see if she would finally shatter under the weight of it all. Finally, the judge called a recess. Natasha found herself alone in a quiet hallway, leaning against the cold tile, the chill a welcome anchor against the tremor in her limbs. Tamika joined her, pressing a cool bottle of water into her trembling hand. His rattled, Tamika whispered, her voice low and steady. You did good. Just a little longer. Natasha nodded, swallowing past the lump in her throat, the weight in her chest a familiar, heavy ache that was slowly, imperceptibly, beginning to shift. When court resumed, the mood had perceptibly changed. Robert, who had entered with such swagger, now looked noticeably less sure of himself, his movements jerky, his eyes darting. The judge's gaze seemed to linger on him longer now, weighing something invisible, a silent judgment that tightened the air. Mr. Goodman, perhaps sensing the shift, called Robert back to the stand. "Mr. Fields, can you describe your financial situation at the time you married Mrs. Fields?" Robert's tone was clipped, defensive, an edge of desperation creeping into his voice. "I had some debt, but big dreams. I always knew I'd make it. Natasha, she helped, but it was my drive that brought us here." Tamika's cross-examination was merciless, a surgical strike at the core of Robert's carefully constructed narrative. "So, if you were so successful, why did you need Natasha's income to pay rent? Why use joint accounts for business expenses? Why is she listed as an emergency contact on your company's original paperwork?" Robert faltered, his carefully rehearsed words catching in his throat, searching for an answer that didn't exist. "That was just logistics," he stammered, sweat beading on his forehead. "She was there, but this was always my vision." The judge's voice, when it cut through the courtroom, was like a knife, sharp, precise, leaving no room for argument. "Let's talk about the prenup, Mr. Fields. Do you have proof this document was filed with the county as required by New York law?" Goodman shuffled papers, a veneer of confidence crumbling around him. We have a copy, Your Honor. The original should be with the clerk." Tamika, with a quiet, devastating finality, slid a stamped letter across the table. "Your Honor, this is a certified response from the county clerk's office. No record of a filing in 2014, or any subsequent year. The document isn't signed by any witness. Unnotarized." A hush fell over the room, so profound that even the bailiff stood up straighter. Robert's face drained of color, and his hands, finally, ceased their nervous rhythm, falling limp on the table. Judge Whittaker leaned back, steepling his fingers, his gaze now sharp as broken glass, piercing through Robert's last defenses. "Mr. Fields, this is a serious omission. The law requires a prenup to be properly executed, witnessed, notarized, and filed. Without those things, it carries no legal weight." Robert tried to interrupt, a strangled sound escaping him, his voice cracking. "Your Honor, this isn't right. She's just..." The judge held up a hand, silencing him, the finality in the gesture absolute. For a moment, the only sound was Natasha's own heartbeat, hammering in her ears, a frantic drumbeat of disbelief and dawning triumph. She stared at Robert, who finally met her gaze, and for the first time, she saw raw panic where there had been only smugness before. The judge continued, his voice heavy, final. "Based on all evidence presented, emails, financial documents, witness testimony, and the failure to execute and file the prenuptial agreement, the court finds in favor of Mrs. Fields." The air was knocked out of the room. Robert's lawyer fumbled for words, but the judge had already moved on, his pen scribbling the final order. "The properties, the business, the holdings, all shall be awarded to Mrs. Fields. There will be no split. Mr. Fields, you are entitled to a portion of the joint savings and one vehicle. The rest is awarded to Mrs. Fields. The business in its entirety belongs to her." Robert's face shifted, a horrifying progression. Shock, then disbelief, then a hollow, silent void. The cocky smile, the knowing smirk, all of it vanished, leaving only a blank, unseeing stare. He started to speak, but the words caught in his throat, dissolving into nothing. Natasha held his gaze, calm and unreadable, her jaw set like iron. The clerk handed Judge Whittaker the last stack of paperwork. The judge signed with a heavy hand, then looked directly at Natasha, a hint of something resembling quiet respect in his tired eyes. "You may be seated, Mrs. Fields. The court's decision is final." Natasha lowered herself into the chair, not trusting her legs, her hands lying flat on the table, steady now. Robert's attorney turned to him, whispering something urgent, but Robert just sat there, silent, unmoving, lost in the echo of a future he thought was his, now irrevocably stolen by his own arrogance and deceit. The judge dismissed the case. The bailiff called for order as people began to shuffle out, their footsteps echoing. Natasha didn't move. She felt every eye on her, The stares, the curiosity, the silent judgments. But she didn't flinch. The familiar weight in her chest was still there, but now it felt different. Solid. Final. Robert still hadn't moved. He was staring at nothing, his hands limp on the table. The pen he'd held earlier dropped to the floor at his feet. No more words left. No more threats. He looked smaller than she'd ever seen him, the shell of a man whose empire had just slipped away, not through fair battle, but through the collapse of his own deceit. Tamika stood behind Natasha, a silent, anchoring presence, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. Natasha finally stood, gathering her bag, every movement deliberate and precise, as if marking the end of one chapter and the resolute beginning of another. She looked at Robert one last time, their eyes meeting just for a second. There was nothing left to say. She turned away, walking toward the door as the room emptied behind her. The last sound Natasha heard as she stepped into the hallway was the heavy wooden door clicking shut, sealing away the decade they'd shared and everything he thought he could take from her.